Hey, everybody. Welcome to The Thoughtful Bro for another amazing episode with a hyper, super, redonkulous, fresh, up-and-coming author. In this case, Jonathan Escoffery. Talking about his debut collection, If I Survive You. I'm really excited about this for a number of reasons, and not all of them have to do with literature. They all have to do with style, though. A certain kind of style, literary style or other kinds of style. I'll get into that in a second. But first, let me say a few words about the Blaze. So, Thoughtful Bro is here every Tuesday at 2, as you know, for what makes great books tick, what makes great authors tick. A Mighty Blaze, the channel on which we air on Twitter, Facebook, YouTube, wherever in the interwebs you are, is an all-volunteer initiative to help writers reach readers virtually during COVID and beyond. And at A Mighty Blaze, we are never, ever asking for your money. Although, in a month or so, we might do a fundraiser. And we may ask you for money for the first time ever then, just to keep the lights on. But generally speaking, we do not ask for money. And if you want to support us and show the love, you can do it by just subscribing to us on social media, smashing that like button, as they say. All this content is completely free. But if you are in the mood to spend some money, I have an idea. Please spend it on white-hot debut books, which cover race, immigration, fatherhood, masculinity, and modern love. Books like If I Survive You by Jonathan Escoffery. Go ahead, open a few browser tabs, look at that beautiful pastel burning cover, and buy 6 copies of it. Regarding questions, if you want to ask Jonathan anything, please put it in the chat wherever you are, and it will make its way to me, and we will ask those questions at the end. And with that, we're going to get started. Jonathan Escoffery is the author of the linked story collection, If I Survive You, which is already, as of this moment, basically instantaneously, a New York Times Editor's Choice, a National Book Award nominee, and an Indie National bestseller. Jonathan is the winner of the Paris Review's 2020 Plimpton Prize for Fiction and is the recipient of a 2020 National Endowment for the Arts Literature Fellowship. He is also a 2021 to 2023 Wallace Stegner Fellow at Stanford University. And if I read to you every single award and grant and fellowship that Jonathan has gotten, we'd be here for 45 minutes because he's just done it all. Jonathan, your star is on the rise. And as they say, you could have been anywhere in the world, but you're here with us. Thank you so much for coming on Thoughtful Bro.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. I'm really happy to be here.
So, as I said, I did want to talk to you about style. Literary style, yes, but that can wait. I want to talk to you about a different kind of style. And I have to say, I try to bring a little bit of freshness every time to Thoughtful Bro. I got my hats, I got my shirts, and I have a lot of hats. I probably have 30 hats. And I'm obsessed with buying hats because they are front and center on this show. But, when your book tour started and I started seeing events that you were doing, I was like, the bro is kicking it up a level. I mean, I just have to say, man, every time I see you on anything, I'm like, I wish I owned that shirt or I wish I owned that jacket. I mean, so I guess here's my question. Here's my question to you. How would you define your personal style?
Oh, wow. How do I define it? Well, first, thank you for the compliments. Thank you for noticing. I just like to go out in the world just in a way where I feel comfortable, but also as an artist, I pay attention to aesthetics in all the ways. And so, I think it shows in the prose in a sense. I think it shows in my clothes. People spend lots of money on their hobbies, and I feel like clothing is just it's a hobby for me. I love jackets, I love shoes, boots, loafers. I love hats, but ever since I started growing my hair about 12 years ago, when I left Miami, when it was, when you're in Miami, it's so hot and sticky, and it was so much easier just to shave my head. And I loved hats back then, but since I've started growing it, it's you don't want to abuse the curls, and so I've kind of let the hat game go. Unfortunately, if I ever figure out how to manage the curls with the hats, then I'll probably bring them back.
Yeah, man. I mean, I have to say, my personal style, I would define as the CEO of a skateboard company. It's sort of that kind of mashup. But I think with you, I mean, I think that's simpler because it's a lot of sort of t-shirts and baseball hats. But with your thing, I mean, it's the boots, the jackets. I mean, like the jacket game is just so on point. I mean, and I think I even like tweeted at you at one point. I'm like, dude, where'd you get that jacket? And I think you said Nordstrom Rack. Is that the spot?
Yeah, that's my new spot. That's my new spot.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, there's a spot called and I won't give away all my secrets, but some of my bigger coats, there's this really dope website called Southern Gents, and they have the just the wickedest I say wicked in the Jamaican way, not the Boston way, but like the best like long coat, like trench coats, but that are stylized in this really wonderful way. And if you ever want to check them out, I highly recommend them as well.
Mm-hmm. There you go. Recommendation. That's gonna be our sponsor next week. You watch. I'm gonna reach out to them. I'm gonna be like, listen to this. Okay. So, all right, we're moving on from style. Although, like, hey man, just incredible props to you for that. So let's talk about this book. This book, which is getting all the hype, getting all the praise, just longlisted for the National Book Award as a debut. I mean, amazing. For me, actually, I want to talk about the first story, Influx, which was like my favorite of the collection and just spoke to me in a lot of different ways. But before I actually go in there, why don't you just take a minute and give us like the thumbnail sketch? What is this book about?
Yeah, I appreciate that. So the book is about a family of Jamaicans who emigrate to the U.S., specifically to Miami, Florida, in the late 1970s. It's a couple named Topper and Sonia, and they bring their young child Delano over in the move. And it's in Miami that they have their second son, who's named Trelawney, and Trelawney is kind of the star of the book in a sense because we spend the most page time with him, and it's kind of his journey trying to figure out who he's going to be as this Jamaican American who sometimes feels more or less Jamaican or American, and a lot of that sense that he has, a lot of his struggle is that people keep telling him what he should or shouldn't be, what he is or isn't. He's asked the question from the very first sentence of the book, what are you? And he's expected from a very young age to kind of define himself in these ways that people keep he doesn't know what that question means, but as he learns more about what the question might mean and imply, even his answers are kind of denied by friends, family, strangers alike. Nobody really will allow him to settle on deciding or defining himself. And so we follow him throughout the book, trying to figure out as he tries to figure out who he's going to be. And at one point he kind of decides that he's going to lean into his Jamaicanness, and he believes that this might be the road that will take him to feeling whole in a sense. But as he tries to reclaim that Jamaicanness, he has this falling out with his father as a result. And that falling out leads him to being kicked out of the house and living out of his vehicle. And we see him struggling to claw his way out of homelessness. And we follow him as he takes on several really odd jobs in his attempt to pull himself to climb the ladder in a sense, to find upward mobility, but also literally put a roof back over his head,
and to just like try to define this just for the viewers, is linked story collection the best way to describe it, or is it a novel in short stories, or is it just plain old short stories, or is it just sort of futile to try to define it?
Well, I mean, what's written on the inner flap of the hardcover, it says linked story collection. I mean, linked stories. But what you'll notice as I'm reading, some of these wonderful reviews that I'm lucky enough to be getting, they're calling it a story collection in the opening sentence, and then the very next sentence they're calling it a novel, and then they're calling it a novel in stories by the end of the review. And I think I understand why that is. It's kind of difficult to define in terms of the form of the book. Where to me, we are following this larger arc of Trelawney trying to find his way in the world and figuring out if he's ever going to feel either the love that he feels he was denied by his father in particular, but also he's looking for, I think, that kind of self-love that is ever elusive in the book. And as we're following that larger journey, though, we're getting these snapshots of, Trelawney as he's trying to figure himself out in school, and Trelawney after he's gone away to college in the Midwest and then returned to Miami, and he's had this falling out and with his father, and he's trying to basically get enough money for gas to put in his car, and he does this by taking on this really weird job. And so we're just spending an hour with him on this weird job. And so it's almost like reading the Odyssey or something, and you're spending time with Trelawney is my Odysseus, and you get these different islands that he's stopping at on his way to finding self-love.
I love that. So let's talk about Influx, this first story. And it's like, I'm not the only one. A lot of people talk about this first story. And for me, it was one of the real highlights of the book. And it's just about, you were alluding to it moments ago, where, Trelawney is trying to discover, like, what is the meaning of his skin? Like, is he black? Is he white? And it begins with this question, what are you? And it's a deceptively simple question, but ultimately it is actually the most complex and unanswerable question imaginable.
Right.
And it's in just in case, like, anybody might think, like, that it is not totally essential and a matter of practicality to figure out this question. Like, you dig into all these different ways where it's like, the girlfriends, he can't go home with any girlfriend because the parents have a rule about dating black guys, or his own mother has a rule about other races of girls that Trelawney can't bring home, or even to some of these jobs he gets on Craigslist, which specifically say, you have to be this race to get this job, or what friend group will he be in? How will he walk? How will he talk? What kind of music will he like? All of these things are just channeled through this, like, elusive definition of race. And, like, even when he, as you said a moment ago, even when he decides, okay, I'm just definitely this, then people say, no, you're actually not. And, like, other people don't even accept his own definition. I just, and I don't want to give it away, but I just thought, what was maybe most masterful about that piece was how kind of ambiguous the whole question remains throughout and through the very end. And anyway, I thought it was just so well done. And I guess I didn't even know what the question is. I just wanted to open it up to you and just to kind of ask you, like, what were you up to there?
Well, thank you. I appreciate that you connected with that story. I had this funny, before I answer the question, I had this funny experience where I was at one of my book launches, and I was signing books, and somebody asked me to sign not on the title page, which is where you usually sign, or collectors will be very upset with you if you don't sign on the title page. But she wanted me to sign the first page of my favorite story. And on the spot, it was like oh, how do I choose? It's like choosing between your children, which maybe for Topper, maybe that's an easy decision for the father in the book, but for me, I decided to sign Influx. And so I signed. I turned to that page, and it's the first story, and I signed it, and she's like, "Really?" And I was like, okay, maybe that wasn't your favorite story. But, for me, it's a really important opening to the book. In a way, it's an opening. It's an important opening and introduction to me as an author and my career, because I had a really tough time figuring out as a writer who I was going to have as my protagonist, in a sense. Like, how was I going to talk about who they are and how they move through the world without talking about these different things like race, like color, like ethnicity, and for me, coming from a place like Miami, those things are very, very important. People wear those things on their sleeves, and they're very adamant about telling you within the first 3 sentences that they ever say to you, like, look, this is what I am, I am. And but at the same time, they very much want to know how to define you And so they may say, and I'll just use my own identity in a sense, or parts of my identity. I might say, well, I'm Jamaican first, let me tell you that. And then they'll want to know, like, where are your people from? Or, sometimes they're trying to get at different information, but they want to essentially know whether or not they should dismiss you forever, or if they feel safe to further engage with you.
Yeah.
And all of that is based on a lot of assumptions that they're bringing to their ideas about different groups. And to me, that's obviously very, very problematic. But in order to even get this character going, I felt like I needed to explore that in a sense, and define that for me. But then I realized it's not easy to define that for a character like Trelawney. And so that in a sense became the story, his, in a sense, inability to define himself, because people are, he can make a choice, but people are going to continually deny his choices and contradict him. And I think you gave a really wonderful rundown of some of the complexity there. And also, I mean, as he moves through the book, Trelawney's probably, a lot of people might think of him as the smartest character in the book, because he's so observant, and he also has this he's more traditionally educated than everyone else in the book, at least in, the main characters. But at the same time, he's so bogged down by this question. I think it prevents him from actually finding success that he may otherwise have found had he never had to invest so much energy and so much mental space in figuring out that question, or the answer to that question.
Right. So I want to tell you a story from my own life, and like kind of how this story was just dovetailing with some things that were going on in my own household. So, my wife is Black, and we have 4 mixed race kids. And my wife was driving along with my son the other day, and he was like looking at his phone and like taking a picture of himself to post like on Snapchat. And he's like doing his hair and everything. And he says to my wife, he says, I love being Black. And so like that was like just an interesting moment. So like, first of all, I mean, there's just like so much there. And so for one, just is that like I'm white and my wife is Black, and like the fact that like he said I'm Black, it's like makes me feel a little bit like, well, wait a minute, like you're like it's like half and half, right? Just the same way if he was like said to me like I love being white, I would be like, you are not white, you are half and half. And but it is such a mixed conversation. And I think like sort of the way that my wife and I were talking about it afterwards is like, what we're trying to do for our kids is give them the confidence to feel like they can be both in a way, and like they can be like at home everywhere, like in every situation they can feel comfortable and feel like themselves. Because I feel like what was so moving to me about your story in Flux was the way that Trelawney is like sort of feeling like he's left nowhere. He's like, there's that fear of like fitting in nowhere. And I'm just like, that's just something that we talk about in my family. So anyway, I mean, that's sort of how that story hit me.
Yeah, I mean, I think younger generations are having more opportunities to define themselves. I'm out in California now, and I'm in the Bay Area, but I was living in the LA area prior to this. And I don't know, when I spend time with teenagers, it just so happens that I know a lot of young 20-somethings and teenagers who are feeling empowered to define themselves in a way that I don't think it was necessarily an option before. And I think that's something that the book is interested in a sense, because I think even the parents in the book, Topper and Sonia, I think they in Jamaica had more ability to define who they are. And but they come to the US in late 70s. Trelawney is born in 1980, and they're in a way they're subject to this kind of one drop rule that the parents they didn't have that experience necessarily, and they never really had to think about it, because they were coming from it is Jamaica I'm talking about, is a majority Black country, but also Jamaica's national motto is out of many one people. And so because there's this South Asian influence in Jamaica, there's Chinese influence in Jamaica. There's a lot of black, white, mixed people, whether they define themselves as such in Jamaica, and I think there's just freedom to be and to just say I'm Jamaican, or to say otherwise. But what the parents kind of fail to recognize is that Trelawney has to move throughout the world of the U.S. and Miami, and at that time, it's less friendly to somebody who is necessarily like trying to define himself, and when people can't pin you down because your presentation is, you have a more either racially ambiguousness about you, or even, I mean, the other way of thinking about it too, though, is my characters, they're multi-generationally mixed. And so for Trelawney, at one point, he's in the Midwest and people are saying, okay, but which one of your parents is white? And so even that becomes an issue, right? So, because he can't just say, well, I'm biracial, even though he takes this DNA test and that, gives him results that in a different kind of world might suggest that he is of two races, but that's just not the context that he's living through, I think. And so, as you said earlier, I mean, it's so complex, and unfortunately, it does bog him down, and in a sense, limit his possibilities in the world of the book.
So I want to ask one more question about race, and then I want to get on to some other issues in the book, because the book is not just about that, it's about so much. But one more question about that is, I just kind of want to talk to you about, like, being a writer, a person of color who's been writing in the last few years and been on the scene. It's been such a wild time for the national race discussion in the last 4 or 5 years. And I think I heard you say in a different interview that some advice you got, I may be getting this wrong, but I think what I heard was some advice you got back in grad school was to not write about race. And, it seems like now that is like the opposite thing might be said, or at least that would not be said. And so suffice it to say, just like an example of how the discussion around race has changed, not just broadly, but also specifically in the arts and in storytelling. And my question to you is just sort of like, what's that been like for you to kind of see how attitudes have changed about stories about race, and there's just been maybe a change of appetite in the kind of story that you're telling?
Yeah, I think, and one thing just to clarify, I mean, the overarching message I got from grad school wasn't that
right.
I shouldn't write about race, but you are correct. Absolutely. I did say this, and this did happen, that I was advised and encouraged in other ways to not write about race. And other writers of color were at times, I was only Black student in the program the entire time I was there. And other students of color, though, were in a sense at times praised for deciding not to write about race. And I think, I appreciated that they felt they had the option to opt out of talking about race. But for me, like, the most important thing is that I had to write about my reality, in a sense. And I didn't want to put, basically attempts to, I don't know, think about how my character would move through the world and somehow redacts every experience that would have been as a result of his, I say his as thinking of Trelawney as my kind of main character, thinking of how people respond to his actual body. Like, I just, it would take more mental energy and perhaps more skill for me to actually be able to write a good book that somehow ignored all of those realities. And so, and I agree with you that things are changing. I think they'll continually change. I mean, something that I love Influx because I think it allows it allowed me to talk about race with nuance. And I started writing Influx in the Obama years. And then I know this is kind of going left with my answer here, but then at a certain point during the Trump presidency, I found I was writing story, and these are not necessarily stories that made it into the book, but I found myself writing like less nuanced stories about race intentionally to scream to say, this is crazy, and these are the conversations we are, it's because it kind of felt like we were screaming at each other
Yeah.
for at least the 4 years, and
Yeah.
and beyond that. So um I have white writers who come up to me, especially when I'm on panels at conferences, who are always asking like, shouldn't I now tell stories from the perspective of, let's say, it's often like a black woman. It's often white women ask me, can I and shouldn't I write from black women's perspectives? And for me, it's like, I think you're missing the point. Like what you as a white woman may want to consider writing about the fact that you are a white woman, and like, it's not just black people who have race to contend with. We all have race to contend with. Maybe none of us made those decisions, but those decisions were made for all of us a long time ago. And so,
Right.
talking about the way your body moves through the world, I think, is I think the more important thing, and the better thing to aspire to, rather than just having um diversity, quote unquote, in your book
Mhm.
for the purposes of, you know getting your book published, I guess.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
Interesting times in that regard for sure. So let's move on. There's so much about this book which is interesting, which is so well done. The literary kind of virtuosity of the book is incredible. I mean, you're speaking in the first, second, third person. You go into all these different characters, and you kind of paint this prismatic, I think was the word that the New York Times used, image of this family, which is great. But, in the interest of time, just to pick out one thing that truly struck me was it was about fathers and sons. And like, I have 4 kids and 3 of them are boys. And, father son issues, I feel like just aren't really written about as much as they could be. And I think, like, for example, like mother-daughter relationships, I think get written about a ton, and they get written about really, really well. And male writers, or whoever is, whatever gender you are, just writing about the father-son relationship is just something that I feel like sometimes gets short shrift. And I mean, there were so many super poignant moments. Like, there was this one moment which is just gutting for me, where there's this line, taken out of context, but sometimes you have to believe in people your father tells you, and you know this. You just wish you were one of the people that people believed in. And that hits a real rich seam for you as an author about self-doubt. I mean, you're very eloquent and moving about Trelawney's self-doubt. And I think a lot of that is connected to this relationship with his father and what he's looking for from his father and he can't quite get. And so I just wanted to ask you about that. And like, do you feel that way too? That, like, maybe father-son relationships aren't quite talked about maybe the way they could be? And was there something you maybe really wanted to get across about father-son relationships?
Yeah, I do feel that way, and none of us can have read everything, but that is kind of the sense that I've had, that's a conversation that needs to be happening more, and I was interested in that, and it's kind of funny because I appreciate you asking this, because sometimes I don't know, like, some people really appreciate the fact that I've written this book about these father son relationships, but then every once in a while I get this kind of like, you seem to have written about like a lot of men,
Yeah.
and I'm like, yeah, like, well, when I am a man, and I'm not a father, but I am a son, and I do have these questions and these concerns about how it is that we can have healthier father son relationships in general, and how lessons that are passed down generationally can be um, you know healthy and more positive, so that we can send better men, better boys who become men out into the world to do better. And I mean, that's, I think, largely the project of, this being fiction. I wanted to think about, some of the lessons that are less helpful, I think, and maybe, with Topper and Delano and
Oh, wait, Jonathan, I lost your audio there. Did you hit something? Can you hear me? Shoot, I lost your audio. Hold on. Yeah, I can't hear your audio. Shoot, I must have lost your audio, Jonathan. I'm sorry. Let's see.
Yeah, sorry.
There we go. I got it back. I got the audio back. So I don't know if the audience lost it, but keep going.
Yeah, sorry about that. Yeah, so I mean, basically, I wanted to explore this question. Like Cholani again is this hyper observant character. I think he's noticing that some of the lessons that are being passed down from father to son aren't the best, aren't the best lessons, are not the best lessons. But he's also
Right.
caught up in the question of, well, can I point that out and still be attempting at the same time to be loved in the same way that I notice my brother is being loved? Because it almost seems like Delano, with some of his problematic attitudes, it's like that problematic attitude is the thing that is helping to bond him with his father. And
Yeah.
I'm interested in these kind of difficult questions of how you might both stop the inheritance of the problematic thought processes, while also not ostracizing yourself within your family. So those are some of the questions I'm interested in. Essentially, yes, I want these men to do better, and
Yeah.
without having these conversations, I don't think we can necessarily do that.
Great. So let's we're gonna have time for some audience questions at the end. But like in the maybe next 10 minutes, I want to talk about some craft things because as I said at the top, you have gotten all these fellowships, you've won all these awards, you've taught. I mean, you were at Grub Street for a long time. I mean, you were definitely somebody who's been around the craft side and the craft discussion for a long time. And so I thought you might have some interesting answers to these questions. So number one, you worked on this book for a very long time, for a year. I don't know how many years it was, but how did you know the time was right to pull the trigger? How did you know this book was done?
Yeah, so my agent likes to put it as, we like, no book needs to be perfect before you query an agent. No book needs to be perfect before you go out to sell it to publishers. And I don't think most books are ever perfect when they're on the bookshelf. But like, knowing what it is how she likes to put it. Knowing what it is.
Mm.
It was like, when it was clear that it was this family dynamic that was going to be explored via a handoff of stories that were going to amount to this larger picture and this larger arc that's hopefully satisfied by the end of the book. Once I had all of that in place and the stories were working both individually but also working to build this larger picture, I think that's when I knew it was done, done enough to go ahead and get it published.
Good. And, you are right now, you're the Wallace Stegner Fellow at Stanford. And I think, maybe you're not doing too much teaching, but at least you're doing some mentoring there.
Mm-hmm.
But I guess my question to you would just be, you certainly, as I said, been around the craft discussion for a long time. And whether you're teaching or mentoring students, what would you say? Like, do you have any like kind of core principles? Maybe not even principles that you necessarily invented, but I mean, certainly those would be good too. But just maybe like whatever you have absorbed over your entire career till now, like what are some of the maybe one or two key things that you try to get across to young writers?
I think grounding the reader in a certain context, whatever the context is that you are creating for your main characters. I think doing that as quickly as possible on the page, so that you are giving them more information and not less information, and you're not trying to keep things from the reader for no good reason. I think if you could tell us the who, what, where, when, why within that first paragraph, in a sense, and then set your characters into motion, we'll actually be a lot more invested in following them wherever it is that they want to go. One way to think about that, after you just put that information into that opening paragraph, obviously, like, not every story needs to be told this way, but let's say you do that. Think about what are the implied questions that a reader of your work would actually want to learn the answer to. And so we know why it is that we as the reader are following your protagonist on this particular day. And so that, we'll want to know what's going to happen. Are they going to be able to get the job before they're evicted, or are they going to be able to convince their estranged spouse to come back to them because they've been forced to meet on this one day, this one last possible opportunity for them to get it back together again. Like, giving us the context so we know what the situation is, and then letting our characters get into motion is important, rather than us trying to figure out, well, what exactly is the situation, and trying to surprise us with just what exactly is going on. Like, that's a really bad plan for a story, I think.
So speaking of plans for stories, I either heard or read you say something like you tend to build stories from the sentence level up. And when I had George Saunders on the show to talk about his craft book, A Swim in the Pond in the Rain, he had very much the same method. His idea is like the DNA of the story is contained within any one of its sentences, and the sort of, like a protein unfolding of a new living creature. It's like, just like the DNA just multiplies itself from the sentence, and then you get a kind of organic, authentic whole. But it's funny because when I asked Saunders about, well, how did you write Lincoln in the Bardo? Like, was it the same method? Like, did you basically need more of a plan? And he said, yes. He said, actually, I did. That was different. And so I know, because I've heard that the next project you're working on will probably be a novel. And I'm just wondering about that. I mean, if you're going to work on something longer, does that kind of sentence level attention and like the multiplying of the sentence building from there, does that work for a plan for a longer piece the way it does for a shorter one?
I think plans are good. I mean, for me, the longest story in the collection, to bring it back to If I Survive You, I don't exactly know what it wound up with after edits and copy edits and all of that, but it was like this 55-page story that I've written, and I had the opening section kind of it. Because I was thinking about some of the conflict that comes before in the book, and this is the title story, If I Survive You. It closes out the collection. I was able to, in a sense, I knew Trelawney's kind of emotional state. I knew that he, I see some of his problem as he sees himself as a human being, but people are saying, but can you choose though? Can you choose to be a Black guy instead of a human being? Can you choose to be just Jamaican then, or could you, so they're asking him to fold himself into a box, and this puts him in a kind of sustained, like a low level sustained rage. And so I see that as his kind of somewhere between his psychological state or his emotional state. My point in saying that is knowing that lens that my protagonist is going to be viewing his situation through is important to me first, and that's how I'm building the sentences, so that everything I'm describing is kind of through that emotional state. And so as I describe the house, it's through that emotional state. As I'm describing these other characters, it's through that emotional state. That said, at a certain point, I needed to get him into this plot, and that's where I broke out, the plan and for me, I used an Excel spreadsheet. It just made sense to me, so I could say, okay, he's interacting with this number of characters. There needs to be an arc for each interaction, or each character dynamic, each relationship, and I built forward. But I needed to know I needed to know the rhythm of the sentences first, and I needed to know that psychology of my character first, and then I built forward with the plan. And then once I had enough of a plan, I came right back to those sentences, and I even deviated from the plan a little bit because I was following the power of the sentences. And so I would say it's both.
I love that. It's sort of, I mean, you don't know how excited it makes me to hear somebody else uses Excel when they're writing, because like I totally use Excel. But yeah, I mean, it just sounds like you're sort of, I mean, that old writing metaphor, you're sort of kind of searching around for like some oil, and then you like hit some oil. And then once you get like an oil, and this is like you experimenting with your language and getting the language right, so that then you hit oil, then you're like, okay, well, I got to build a rig around this so I can get the oil out. And I got to kind of think long term now. And then after you do that, then you can go back to focusing on like, you know, the oil gushing. But I like that kind of like search, then do some planning, then kind of go back to like the original inspiration.
Right. Absolutely. Yeah.
All right. One more question about craft, and then we'll go to a few audience questions real quick before we wrap. So again, this is from an interview you did on LitHub, and I just love this sentiment so much about craft. You said, quote, the most important thing a writer can do, I think, is sharpen their sense of whether what they are attempting to accomplish on the page is likely to be received by their ideal readers as they intended. And the workshops at many of the programs I've attended helped me build confidence in that skill. And so I absolutely agree that like one way to define successful art is just, is the reaction in the audience, in the reader, the intended reaction, the reaction that the writer, the creator intended. And so I guess, I mean, I 100% agree with that. And I just want to ask you though, like, how do you know? Like, I mean, is it, I mean, it's like, for example, like say like the emotion here was self-doubt or revenge or whatever, I don't know what, or falling in love. And did you feel that? I mean, is it so simple as just asking that question? How do you know if your piece is landing is what I want to ask.
I mean, I think that's the power of workshops. And if you're not in an official, if you're not with a student in a graduate program, if you're not attending a 10-week workshop that you paid for or got a scholarship for, or whatever it is, you know, keeping some readers who are writer friends, basically, who are willing to, you know, give you responses to your work is important. But what I think is powerful about the workshop, I know it gets criticized, but when you're putting students in that cone of silence, the idea is that you're going to hear people talk about your work, and you're going to now know that you intended, you know, this and this and this to happen. Sometimes you don't have that many specific intentions, but you're able to hear them tell the story back. I had a professor who, rather than having us jump into critique, she had us sit. I mean, we're seated around a table, and she would have students retell the story of what happened. And that, to me, is probably the most important thing you could ever have done, where people are just saying, this is literally like what happened. This is what the character walked out their front door. And if that's not actually what happened, you know, now you know, okay, there's something going on the page, because 5 different students, peers, said that they think my character walked out the front door, when actually all they did was they went to the bathroom, you know. And so being able to listen to people talk about their experience of your story is really important.
I love that exercise so much, and I've kind of heard different kinds of versions of that over time. But I think like another thing that happens is when you describe your work in that way, and you have to like verbally just say it without looking at anything you've written, you sort of end up telling the story that like you definitely think you told. And then it's just, but then people are just like, what? And it's like, it's so important, because I think like the story that you verbally tell is like, I would bet most of the time closer to what you mean,
Right.
you know, than maybe sometimes what's on the page.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, sometimes even in these interviews, I find myself saying, this is, you know, Trelawney. And I think I wrote a great book, don't get me wrong, but I'm like, no, Trelawney's issue is, and then I have to think, was that on the page? And then I'll think, oh yeah. Page 145, he did definitely. But we're all, you know, this can happen to all of us at any stage in our writing career, I think.
Right. All right, so we're going to have a few audience questions, and we had one a second ago, which was great from Bozina. Yeah, I love this question. Ideal readers, could you describe yours? And it was actually another question that I did want to ask you. I mean, I just love this question generally, which is sort of, I think it's so informative about how the writer sees themselves and sees the tradition that they're in, and kind of you see the intention of the author when they answer this question, but just who is this book really for? Or to put it in Bozina's words, who are the ideal readers?
Yeah, for me, I don't, it's a really great question. I think readers who are suspicious of the world around us about the narrative about, I should say, the world around us as we've been told that narrative. Those are my ideal writers, because I'll have someone come up, readers. I mean, I'll have someone come up to me and say, it's clearly like Trelawney, he is just a Jamaican American, and that's it's wrong that people are denying him that. And I think the bigger point though is that he shouldn't necessarily be forced to. So my ideal reader is the reader says he shouldn't be, identity is so complex that he may have this and he may have that aspect of his identity. But the larger question is, should people be forced to push themselves into these really rigid categories that are created sometimes not for the person who has to force themselves into that box? Oftentimes it's not created for. Most of my identities, I didn't create those boxes, but now I have to figure out which ones that I'm going to tick on a census form or whatever. So observant readers are my ideal readers.
Awesome. All right, let's do one more audience question. If my producer could just throw it up there. All right. Can you tell us about your path to publication? Yeah, and to get back to a question I asked earlier, how long has this work been in the works?
Yeah, I first thought of these characters in late 2010, and I sold the book. When did I sell the book? I think it was last year, right? 2021, spring of 2021. So 10 or so years. But that doesn't necessarily mean I was writing, sitting down and knowing exactly what the book was and writing the book consistently. That might be half the time. And there were periods where I'd send the manuscript to my agent, and she would be like, "Look, I've got some people in front of you." And she would come back after some number of weeks with great feedback, and I'd be like, "Okay, I'm going to read this, and now I'm going to think about it for another 6 months before I do anything about it." And so it took a lot of time. The great thing about being a story writer is that you can focus on a story and just seeing, like, can I tell one good story, and then you can start submitting that to magazines. And by the time I started, I'll say I got two prizes. I submitted for a fiction contest, and I won the Passages North fiction contest, and that opened up the door with a lot of editors soliciting work from me. And then that was just through Slush Pile. And then with my agent, she submitted to the Paris Review, and I won the Plimpton Prize. And that really opened the door for me with a lot of publishers, because then at that point, publishers were writing to either my agent directly or writing to me directly and saying, "Okay, where's the book? We want to see the book." And that I always think of that, once I got a story in the Paris Review, it was I'm not saying it was guaranteed that I was going to have a book, but it took a lot of pressure off of things, because I just knew so many people were waiting on the book after that point.
Well, that's cool that your agent is submitting your short stories. I didn't know that kind of thing still went on. That's really cool.
It's the reason why I chose my agent. My agent is Renee Zuckerbrot. She's wonderful. She believes in the stories, and that's why I went with her. And I was fortunate that a friend of mine had found out about her at I think it was the Sewanee summer conference, and said, "Hey, there's an agent who actually really loves stories. You should query her." And that's exactly what I did.
That's awesome. What a great story. So hope for all the short story writers out there. That is cool. All right. So we're going to wrap here, Jonathan. This has been amazing. Thank you for going to all the weird, funky places that I wanted to go. This has been such a kind of light on, the publishing process, the craft of writing, and your book, man. I'm just so happy for you. It's not like a lot of other books that you see out there. It's definitely very unique, and I'm just so glad it's getting the attention it deserves. So just one last question that I always ask. We were talking a moment ago about ideal readers, and a question I love to ask every writer that comes on the show is, so you were just describing who the ideal reader is. Now just imagine for a moment that ideal reader, and they've just finished If I Survive You, and they look out the window or wherever they are. And just describe for me, if you could, in a phrase or even a word, what is the feeling that you've left this reader with?
Oh, I think the word recognition comes to mind, and I'll say, like, in all of the ways, recognition. Recognizing a slightly truer version of our reality, in a sense, perhaps a lived experience of their own, but also, there's recognition in the familiar, and there's also recognition, I think, in things that we may have taken for granted, that we're looking at a little bit more closely.
I love that. Yeah. And I mean, I am not one of the people that you described in this book, but I can imagine, also if like you were somebody, you think like I've heard you describe this book as, feeling like people could, like, you didn't see these kinds of people in a book before. And like, I haven't seen these people in a book before either. And it just was opening doors for me. And so I recognized in my own way, this is a totally different kind of person out there that I hadn't read about before. So I just really appreciated that.
Thank you. Well, I really appreciated being here, and this has been a wonderful conversation for this author. So, thank you.
All right, man. We'll keep the style fresh. I know you won't have any problem in that department. You're giving me, like, I see what the bar is high now. So, all right, folks, thank you for tuning into The Thoughtful Bro this week. I'll be back next week with actually another National Book Award long-listed author named Tess Gunty. So more about that later in the week. But Jonathan, thank you so much for coming on the show. This has been a real treat.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you.
All right, folks. We'll see you soon. See you next week on The Bro. Thanks, everybody. Man, it's taking an extra long time to get off air. There we go.
We're still on air.
No, we're still on air. Oh my God.
Hi.
This is amazing. It said an error occurred.
On now too.
Yo, this is live TV, baby.
Crazy today. Woo, 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 woo.
Hi, Jenna.
Hi.
All right, let's see if we can get off air this time.